Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming.
Uh-oh.
My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including a story time with Zena Pilska this Saturday, Martha Waters and Sarah Hogle on June 30th, and Maggie Takuda Hall on July 2nd. You can register for these and any other of our events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase Sarah and Claudia's books. You can send any questions you have for the authors to answer at the end by clicking Ask a Question, and you can send any comments using the chat function where it says Say Something Nice. And just so you know, this event will be recorded. We're very excited to welcome Sarah and Claudia. I'd like to tell you a little bit about them, and then I will turn the event over to them. Sarah Blake is the author of Full Turn, a chapbook of poems, Runaway Girls, an art book in collaboration with the artist Robin Kahn, and 3 novels, Grange House and the New York Times bestsellers The Postmistress and The Guest Book. Sarah lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and their 2 sons. The Guest Book, which is the subject of tonight's discussion, is a novel about past mistakes and betrayals that ripple throughout generations. It examines not just a privileged American family, but a privileged America, which is certainly a timely issue. And Sarah will be reading a few pages from the book tonight as well. Claudia Rankine is the author of 5 collections of poetry, 2 plays, numerous video collaborations, and is the editor of several anthologies. Her next publication, Just Us, An American Conversation, is out in September and can be pre-ordered at belmontbooks.com. Claudia is the founder of the Racial Imaginary Institute. Among her numerous awards and honors, Claudia is the recipient of the Bobbitt National Prize for Poetry, the Poets and Writers Jackson Poetry Prize, and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lannan Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, United States Artists, and the National Endowment of the Arts. She's a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and teaches at Yale University as the Frederick Eisman Professor of Poetry. She lives in New Haven, Connecticut. And without further ado, I give you our authors.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much, Stacy. Thanks for Belmont Books for bringing us together. A couple of months ago, when Stacy asked who I'd like to be in conversation with, I said to myself, well, Claudia, always. I always want to talk to Claudia ever since we met 30 years ago. No, not even. In a poetry workshop. And we've been talking and thinking for a long time, but in particular this book, because so much of the thinking in it and the working on it came through talking with Claudia. And so I'm so happy and feel super lucky that you could be here tonight, Claudia.
You.
I thought we'd just talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then read a little, and then we'll kick it open. Mm-hmm. And so when I started thinking about the guest book, which it was 2008, and I knew only that what I wanted to do was write a big, juicy, multi-generational family novel. And I knew, though, that if I did it, I wanted to write it the way that Thomas Stoppard had written the play Arcadia, where if you've seen it, you remember it traces one family between 1816 and the present, moving back and forth, scene to scene, but stays in one place. It's one room of the family house. And I knew that I wanted to try and write a novel that somehow approximated that, because in it you can see past and present literally on top of each other, and the ways in which the kind of pathos of history, the echoes and repetitions that happen because we don't know fully what happened in the past. The past doesn't know what's coming. The present doesn't know what's past. So I was thinking that's the structure that I wanted, the flipping back and forth. And Obama was running for president, and he gave his first major speech on race in Philadelphia, in which he invoked Faulkner's lines, "The past isn't dead in this country, it isn't even past." And he was saying this to remind us that his candidacy was going to kick off a conversation about his race and about race in the nation. And when I heard that, for me, that was a kind of electrifying moment. I really wanted at that point to break the silence around race and class and anti-Semitism that I had grown up in. And I heard his comments as a kind of call. And I wanted that this family story to somehow enter the conversation that seemed to have been kicked onto the surface of the country, that had always been kind of, for me anyway, kept below. And so as I'm thinking about this and how I might do this, I am above my head, and I would move the computer, but I'm a little bit terrified of like breaking into the thing. There's the quote by James Baldwin, which came to be the epigraph of the book, which is, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, well, what if I took that literally? What if I thought about the history that's trapped in us? Like, first of all, whose history? Which history? And is there a way to think about springing the trap? And as I'm sort of mulling this around, I'm thinking about the ways in which family history, which is often passed down half told in silence and becomes then family history or family mythos, might be a really good way to think about this country's collective racial history and the ways in which it has been half told and the ways in which it's been passed down. So I thought I was going to use Baldwin as a kind of centering structure, and especially I was ready to think about my own place in his trap, which is white and WASP and old money. What was the history inside a family like mine, and what would a novel look like that passed down over time? So the guest book is about 3 generations of an old money family that has run out of its money, but not its place, which is importantly an island off the coast of Maine, which gives it its sense of place. And it moves back and forth in time, scene to scene, from the 30s to 1959 to the present, as you watch the sort of consequences of a night in the 30s passed down in silence, half told. And I thought I would read a little bit from the end, given the kind of moment in the country right now, the conversation about race and whiteness. And so I'm going to read a small scene that takes place between Moss Milton. This is in 1959, which is the sort of center of the knot of the novel. And it's on the day of an engagement party for one of the Milton daughters. And Reg Pauling, who is an African-American writer, and his best friend, Len Levy, who is secretly having an affair with Joan Milton, who is Moss's sister, have arrived unannounced that morning, but not uninvited. Moss had invited them to come. And Moss and Reg have become friends over the course of this summer. So this is a conversation that they have right towards the end of the kind of explosion open that happens in the book. Everyone up there, Reg pointed up the hill toward the barn, is so unfailingly polite. earnest, good-spirited. So they're holding their breath. We are, he said tiredly, ruining the party. No, Moss said. No? Look at me honestly and tell me that you aren't proud to have me here. Proud? Of course I'm proud. Moss was mystified. Reg put his hand in the water and drew it sharply back. It was bone cold. I don't want to be a badge of honor worn on the outside, he said. I don't want to be taken up like knitting, like a dog, un chien de salon, the whole race problem tamed. Because that's what I imagine them all thinking up there at the party. A Black man can be taken in stride, even taken in hand, because we were all standing there, drinks in our hands, looking at sunsets, singing. We were all standing together. Red shook his head. I want to be inside. I want to be alongside. You are, Moss was fervent. You are. You are the whole thing, he wanted to say. You are more than that. Reg, he went on, this afternoon I saw it. I saw how you were at the center of it all, and I wrote it. I got it down. The song about all this, about the Black man, how you are the new note. And listen, Moss, we have always been at the center, always. It's only that you've just decided to take a look. Moss shook his head. And I'm not a goddamn belle, Reg said. I'm a man. Moss gave a laugh that was half a groan. Damn it, I know that. Reg shook his head. You can't slip your history, man. That's what I'm telling you. That's the story I keep getting again and again. Those people, he said, pointing at the island, your parents, whatever they did, whatever they didn't do in their lives, that's what's in you, no matter what you say or do. Moss shook his head. Listen to me, Reg. You're right with me. We're here. We can make it all happen. We can show people the change that's coming, that's possible. Change? Reg repeated. The ferocity of his bitterness surprised him. All that he had held back, all that he hadn't said, was directed at the man across from him in the boat. You think change comes without change? You think you can open the door and then keep the rooms on the other side exactly the same? Come in, sure, but don't touch. Don't sit on the furniture. Watch where you're stepping. That's not change, man. That's a dinner party. All the guests come, and then all the guests go home. Reg saw the expression on Moss's face and was so weary just then, so tired. He was tired of being the man at the center, banging the gong. He wanted, was it too much to ask? He wanted Joan to choose Len. He wanted to ride in this boat. He wanted to walk with Moss arm in arm through the door Moss imagined was open. He wanted, was it always too much? A happy ending. Do you want to know what your sister said to me? He said. Moss shook his head. You don't marry a Jew, Evelyn said to me. Change would be Joan marrying Len and your mother rejoicing at the wedding. Change would be the white boys and the black boys going to school together, the same school, and 2 years later, all those boys in jobs, instead of those black boys cleaning the toilets of the girls and boys they walked off the graduation stage with. Then that's what we have to tell people, Moss said. People? What people? Black people already know the news, Moss. White people have to face it. And it's a rare man who points to it and says, look there at what is between us, who calls it into the open, who admits there is a fight and says, now what? Moss sat listening, sick at heart. But when you say it like that, Black people this, white people that, you separate. You draw attention to it. You make it worse. It was already worse, Reg answered, before I arrived. America rose out of that handshake in Philadelphia, 1776, that simple deal. You give us your signatures to fight the British, we'll give you your slaves. That is what's at the bottom of the jar. And some want to remember and some want to forget. But you can't take a sip and not take it in. But Black people can't forget what's at the bottom. We will never forget what's at the bottom. But if this country could just say, all right, yes, it's there, then we can fill the jar of moss. Then we can start singing.
Thank you. So I'm just going to kind of dive in because the guest book is, for me, a really phenomenal work, partly because it tries to investigate whiteness in terms of legacy, in terms of money, and in terms of its relationship to other races. And I wondered, did you feel, because I happen to know that the island is something that is personal to you, do you see it as a gift structurally to the book, in the creation of the book? Because you think, there are articles about whiteness as property, and you're able to look at whiteness through first the acquisition of that island, and then what the island means. And even with the loss of wealth in terms of cash, the island is also cash. But what else does it mean for you?
Well, I think the thing about the island, first of all, it is a place that it's been in my family for 4 generations. And so that sense of a place where you can watch yourself grow through the voices and the echoes of the people around you. The place holds you, and so is a kind of witness to your childhood self and your adolescent self and grown-up self. But as I said, it's the place that gave us place. I mean, we were very much attached to the sense that this property made us who we were, and the way in which it held us, it sort of remembered us. It was a kind of physical representation of who we were.
And who are you? Who are you?
We are just these old money with a sense of the people who are the hosts of the country. The guest book is very much, that title is about that sense of this property gives us the power to invite people in or out. And I think I wanted very much to think also about the ways in which an island is, the way to pull yourself out of, the conversation, what's going on in the mainland. It's both a retreat and a refuge. But in this case, it's also the sort of witness of the worst of the Miltons, as well as the kind of keeper of the mythology. And I wanted the book to show that, like how a place can in fact be a witness and can in fact force you to see how things are passed down.
But given that the island is the thing at the center of the book as the thing that can be lost, what is being lost with the loss of the island? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
In terms
I do.
of
I
the
mean,
construction of
absolutely. I
herself.
think the sense of place, the sense of whiteness, or not the sense of whiteness, the sense of identity that is invisible to this family, as in the way in which the island holds it, the property holds it, the property conveys it. And so part of the conversation of the book is, do we let it go? Does the third generation let it go or not? And Evie, who is in that third generation, she knows that she doesn't know the full story, but she doesn't want to have inherited the anti-Semitism that she grew up in, but nonetheless, the island is hers. And so that sense of what it's given her, what it's conveyed, she finds hard. I mean, that's what she's embattled, by the end. And at the very end, when Reg, this character who is speaking, he does come and he sort of tells her the full story of the island, and says, so what are you going to do? And she says, I don't know. And he goes, well, that's a good way to start. But would you take all of it? And she said, yes, all. I mean, and there's a sense that she understands what all of it might mean. But that's the question.
And you also, when you started, you said that the book holds race, class, and anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And I wondered why it wasn't race, class, racism, and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense. I think the conversation, yes, I'm including racism with the conversation with the word race, but saying racism would be implicating the white family in the way. So, yeah.
So the I don't know. I'm a little bit unsteady because I don't know sort of what plot things are off limits. But anti-Semitism, as it's located in 1930s, 1940s Germany, is at play in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I often wonder why because the book is about whiteness, and so facing whiteness, is it easier to come in through the door of anti-Semitism than through the door of racism?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly for me, I mean, given the fact that this book took about 9 years, and my own coming to try and figure out, as I said, my place in this as a white woman, completely evolved and sort of moved closer and closer towards the conversation, the larger conversation we're having now. But I definitely started the book thinking I wanted to really pay attention to the anti-Semitism that I had grown up in, because that was something I could see. And I, certainly my grandparents were, the sort of, I guess, garden variety WASP anti-Semites that, there was that sense of this is just how it was. But to my ear, hearing them talk about this Jew or that Jew, I could hear that and hear that there was something that I didn't want to pass on, but really wanted to think about how does that even happen? So that's what started it. But I mean, because we talked about this all the way through the making of this book, I grew into seeing that this was a book about whiteness. I didn't start seeing that. And I think that's in part what was the kind of tremendous excitement and sort of terror about the book. Like as I get farther and farther in, I understood what I could see and what I couldn't, and that what I couldn't was very much part of what I was trying to tease out. So by the end, and this keeps going. But I think that the way into it was being able to isolate identifiable anti-Semitic behavior that then could open the door outward. And I think.
What did you not know about whiteness at the beginning of the process that you felt you had grown into through the writing of the book by the end?
I think the notion of how we pass down structures and how we don't see what we're in, even as we think we do. I mean, Evie, I'll just, the third generation, who's a history professor, she's a feminist. She has written an entire, or her whole sort of academic career centers around silence and breaking silence. And she feels that she wants to get to the bottom of the silence that has very clearly animated and sort of identified the Miltons, her grandmother and her mother, who has just died. So that's sort of centers it. But I think that that sense of silence as a means to protect yourself as much as a means of aggression was something I came to understand was actually something that was very much a part of me, the sort of dance between saying and not saying how I was implicated, even as I was working towards seeing the distances in generations. But I think just the writing out of the varying ways in which I could take for granted the place and property and my family and legacy, and have a structure that stood for that I still couldn't totally see. I mean, but the writing helped me towards that.
The piece that you read right just now, gestures towards Moss or Reg's, the Black character's anxiety about being a token, tokenism. And how difficult was it to integrate Reg into the novel, since he is the lone Black character in the book?
Mm-hmm. When he arrived after Len, and as I said, I wanted to start with actually just the 50s and the present and this Jewish WASP love affair. But I wrote the scene where he and Len kind of come to the island, which is way at the end of the book, almost like right sort of in the beginning. And I didn't know that Reg was coming. And when he arrives, when he and Len are there, and I'm writing about Joan walking down the hill and sees him there, I realized that he was there, and I needed to have him. I needed to write him. I needed to figure out why and what my relationship as a white author was, and who he was in this story. And I was always in my head from very long, since the early 90s, when Toni Morrison says the dream is always about the dreamer. I was ready to think about, like, what my narrative relationship was to Reg. And I remember talking to you early on when I sort of described that he had arrived and that I didn't know how, but he was going to be important and vital in the book. And you said, well, and I said, he was going to be somebody who sees he's going to be the sort of outsider who sees. And you said, well, whatever you do, he can't die. You can't kill him. And we talked a lot about this sort of that sense of the default narrative of what happens in a white imagination to a Black character, and what would that be doing? I would reaching for a narrative that seemed to make sense given his ability to see and his transgressive, but what would that be perpetuating? What would that be doing? And so that was already the first, the sort of first awakening of like, okay, this is a white writer, like seeing like the ways in which that narrative is just in there. So what does it mean to change it? What does it mean to think about a different outcome? And I remember as I'm writing it, also feeling like, but I don't want to minimize the danger that he would have been in. So all of those negotiations around what is, what narrative is the old narrative in my head, and how reality or what would have been logical would have happened. So it was a constant discussion with what is Reg showing me about the limits of what I imagine, and my own race and my own sort of sense of what it is that I'm doing.
And also, I would imagine alterations in the trajectory of the plot making.
Yeah, absolutely.
To accommodate the presence. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing is like, always I was wondering, this trap of Baldwin's, like, what are the ways you can start to spring that trap? And I think that, this is a commonplace at this point, but first of all, identifying the narrative as, for what it is, but then figuring out how to make a new plot, make something where the narrative is not that one, it's something else. It's something that we're actually trying to imagine together, being aware of the limits of that imagination.
How would you say, again, without going into plot detail, desire works in this book? I mean, what's desire's relationship to a novel whose ambition in part is to critique whiteness, to critique Americanness, to critique blindness,
Blindness, yeah, especially, yeah. So what do you mean by desire? Like,
well, I'm just thinking, there are lots of love stories in the book. Len, many people want other characters to do things for them, and they come up against their inability to reach, get beyond their own capacities and their own imagination. So I know it's sort of a big umbrella. I could specifically point to an event. Since you've brought up Moss, what do you think Moss's desire for Reg is? Like, what is the reach in that relationship?
Yeah, Moss is he's one of my sort of favorite characters because he's he's kind of tragic. But I think that what he is hoping from Reg, I mean, he's incredibly drawn to Reg. They both were in the same class in college, and they've sort of become friends over the course of this summer, and they're going and listening to music together. Reg is, I think, the person that if he could, Moss would fall in love with. But it's that he says at one point, I want Reg to see me. I want Reg to see me, warts and all. That Reg he represents the desire from Moss to be fully seen, to be fully himself. He's about to go work for his father's firm at the end of the summer. He's a musician, but he's going to have to leave that behind. So Reg is this kind of, both literal person when he says, I know you're a man, as well as the kind of place where he hopes, or a person who can look at him and see him totally. I think the thing is that in terms of whiteness, Moss's mother, Kitty, who is the matriarch, who sort of is the one who structures this entire island around silence and something she does, she uses Reg as a place, I mean, literally, and he calls her on it, where she drops a secret, where she tells him, something that she did. And so there's a way in which, even though Moss and Kitty are very different, the desire and the way that they use Reg ends up being similar. It's the desire to be fully clean of themselves or fully seen. And I think that there are other characters who actually, like Joan, who is Evie's mother, who's the woman who's in love with Len Levy, just wants to be herself. She just wants to be fully who she is. So there's a lot of negotiation with understanding that they are not who they are. And I mean, the Miltons. So, and yet they choose to remain who they are.
And I guess partly what I'm sort of not fishing, but interested in is that these Black characters then become the Black character, the Jewish character, they become a place where the Miltons get to step outside of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the island. So they're a safe place. I mean, it's not, they still don't have to break with whatever it is, they're on that land. So that property has allowed for this revelation, but in fact, it also keeps the secret. And that's something that what I really wanted to do as the writer was show that was going on, that in fact these characters existed for the white characters as a place and a kind of provocation, but also a kind of I guess a mirror that they hope. No, that's not true. But that they're the place that the family can feel safe in actually revealing. And in fact, nothing overt is broken, but the family, we do trace, when people make the choices that they do lose. But again, the spectacle of watching that dance was the one I wanted to try and create, and the pattern, the way in which it kept passing down because of the quiet. Kitty is the one who says some things are better off left unsaid. And Moss there is saying, but when you say it like that, when you say it so nakedly, and that both have this allegiance to Kitty to keeping quiet, but Moss to not speaking all the way. I mean, I think this is again the sense of whiteness that if we mention exactly how it is, then we're going to really have to say that there's difference, and who we are in it, and what's what causes that, and what's our relation to that.
The what is the differential? It's 171,000 for a white family to 17,000 for on average for Black family.
In terms of the wealth gap?
Yeah, in terms of the wealth gap.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to scan the novel to see if I don't remember a place we see the relative wealth, but do we see the other side of that in terms of any, I guess, Len and Red share an apartment uptown somewhere, but were you conscious of wanting to show what it meant not to have? I mean, I know a lot of the anxiety in the novel is about the loss of the island itself, and not being able to pay the taxes and et cetera, et cetera. But I wonder how much does the novel push beyond the question of wealth and extreme wealth to realities.
Are you saying because there isn't another side? It's pretty much remains in the land, even when it's on Manhattan, of the Miltons.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, one of the things, I mean, it's, that's a totally germane, because one of the things that Paul, who is Evie's husband, who's a professor, so in the third generation, he is Jewish, and he's having a conversation with Evie at one point about the sort of actually calling forth. He's just come back from Berlin, and he's talking about the way in which we're just going to keep repeating until we confront, the full history. And one of the ways to do that is to physically stop and in a place where something happened and make the through lines between past and present. And he's talking about the stumble stones in Berlin. And he's saying, like, what would it be like if we had that here, that kind of physical representation, and says, where are the Jews in Henry James? Where are the Blacks in Nathaniel Hawthorne? That sense of the elision of the not Milton's, the reality, the not the island. And, I thought a lot about that, because of course that is what you're describing. Where are the people of Manhattan? And I didn't. I kept it. There's Len and Reg's apartment, and then there's Moss's apartment. But that's pretty much it. I mean, it is still a pretty limited Manhattan. I mean, there's sort of omniscient moving through, but no.
The question, one of the things that I often hear white writers say is, I'm not going to include Black people in my work because it's too dangerous. And I sometimes suspect it's because they don't have any Black people in their lives. But whatever, so they write these books where no people of color appear. And this, I think it's correct to say, this is the first book where you've done that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so did you have a lot of anxiety around embarking on a representation that was more full, more realistic about the world we all live in?
Absolutely. And especially what it was gonna show very clearly about what I could and couldn't imagine, like what were the borders of my own imagination, but also it, the sense anyway of trying to render, I mean, any character, the sort of active imagination of making them whole. How was I going to do that when I don't have many Black people in my life, but I do have important people who are, and I think that the sense most, I mean, the anxiety really had to do with getting it right, and then also getting it right with the knowledge that it was always going to be my own imaginary out there, to see. So what that was going to look like. But as I said, when Reg appeared, I was like, okay, I'm scared because I want to, do him honor and justice, but we'll see.
You want to do him honor and justice, or also don't want to appear racist? Yes? No?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing, but I think that's what, I've just lost. I think that that's the part of the thing when you have to face your own, like, conditioning. I mean, this is what we were talking about that narrative, where I was like, well, because I had been thinking he was probably that the logical thing would be that he would have to die. And that's, there it is right there. What's that? And what is it, what would it mean to set that down once again? And, so, yeah, I mean, I wanted to be as honest and also was scared of what that was going to look like. And
did you have the same anxiety around portraying a Jewish character?
No.
Why,
I mean,
why not?
Because I think it's definitely, the third rail is race, and there's that sense of what's going to be shown by the way in which I can or can't, write this character. And that was very much part of what I was working through as I'm writing Reg. Who is he in relation to Kitty? Who is he in relation to Len? What is that? What is he asking me to think about? But and I think again, the book started for me in 2008. I mean, over the last 12 years, the conversation of, the racial imaginary as you've set out into the world, the sense of ourselves as at the sort of limitations and our racial selves in representation, like not just how we read, but how we're thinking and writing. I mean, I think at this point now it's like, yeah, okay. So there it is. Oh, there it is. Oh, I hadn't seen that. I mean, I feel like this is the thing. I was much more anxious, when it began, but I also think that the conversation has gotten bigger and broader, and this is what there is to talk about, like exactly the ways in which your racism shows in the way in which you're thinking and making, and what that, and what does a sentence look like that would be different, that's reparative, how can we think beyond, not beyond, think fuller.
Yeah. Good. And I had another question about that. I mean, you did, I know, because as you say, we talk a lot. You did a lot of reading. Mm-hmm. in preparation and alongside the writing of this book. And so I'm always, people say, well, I can't do this, but obviously you were able to do it. but it didn't come without the rigor of research that you would bring to anything else, that you would bring to the time that you were writing about, the if it's an investment firm, studying So what did you read that was most important to you? The most helpful in terms of not applying what you're reading, but what reading gave you the chops to write in a way?
I mean, I have to say that Baldwin really was a guide, both just in that very tiny little moment of like structural, like what if I really did try and do that literally? What would that look like? But also the way in which he was taking on race and the way in which the white imagination has created the Black. And I mean, everything that we're talking about, he has written already. And so he was a guide, but and just in terms of how to think about especially that time period, the 50s, which is, I was wanting to set it in the moment before everything kind of kicks onto the surface, like where what was going on in terms of race and expectations between races was still hadn't come out into kind of civil rights movement, but was, the patterns were all there. And so Baldwin was probably the most important for me. And yeah.
What about in terms of writing about whiteness? What helped there?
Well, as I said in the beginning, I mean, in some ways, the desire to write a big, juicy family saga is about the whitest thing you can do. That sense that this family was going to speak for the country, like that notion and of legacy and memory and pattern. With family trees. I mean, I was always thinking in terms of, joining the Forsyte saga, like really thinking about that, which is, about the sort of foundation of British middle class and upper middle class culture in the 19th century. So, and, I am a Victorianist, so I have been steeped in the sense of repetitions and as it crawls forward. So, but it was only really in the writing of the book that I came to see even what whiteness was. I mean, again, because I was talking to you a lot, and this was moving more and more into an actual seeable thing, rather than just like, well, this is what novels do. I mean, this is what big family novels do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So.
When I know we're supposed to take questions at some point, but maybe we'll
break. Should we break into some questions?
Yeah, because it is 7:53.
Yes. Let's hear.
Okay. Thank you for that wonderful discussion. And we have... Okay, following on Claudia's question, Sarah, the purchase of the island is compensation for a mother's inconsolable loss. What does this loss represent as it reverberates? Not simply the loss of the nation's idealism, surely, but of a paternalism that underscores American exceptionalism and slavery. The vulnerability of the rich, a loss one can't make up with money, the refusal to be vulnerable and so to distinguish the wealthy from all others. And that is from Linda.
I think, that's a great question, because the thing is, Kitty's loss, she suffers a sort of really terrible trauma in the first chapter. Kitty's loss is one of the things that I wanted to use to think about how people can not see their own kind of complicity because they have suffered this trauma. And Kitty was a character that I wanted, importantly, not to be a monster. She wasn't, even though what she does is monstrous. And but I wanted her to be complicated enough, close enough so that you couldn't put her aside. You had to look at the fact that she had suffered this loss. Nonetheless, she should not be let off the hook. That wasn't something that should allow her to not be seen, and her anti-Semitism not be seen. And I remember when I realized that the first chapter was going to stand and there was going to be this great loss, it meant that I had to stick it to her character a little bit more forcefully. She had to be clearly who she was so that both things were going on. And again, that's, I think, the sort of hope of the novel is to be looking as clearly as it can at everything going on at the same time. And that's part of the mythos, that we have this thing that we're quiet about, but we're going to act on it.
Great. Kathy said, the book came out a year ago. We're in a very different moment right now than we were in 2019. Wondering how, for both Sarah and Claudia, your thoughts about this book and this conversation have changed.
Well, I think, one of the things that the reason I read what I read is that notion of what now. And, I think it's one of the things that seems to be very much on the surface in this last 3 weeks is that sense of white people coming to see the news that Black people always knew. And so now what? And Moss's sort of inability to see how he is objectifying Reg by his own desire. This is a little bit, to Claudia's question, is problematic. And but Reg is saying, okay, so we can start your song if we can acknowledge. And so I think that the book has, the conversation and the book have been riding towards the same moment.
Yeah, I find the book even more relevant now. We have a rise in white supremacy, and there suddenly this moment has tied white supremacy, whiteness, racism, all into one big loop, and brought it back forcefully, even though it was always there. But it's right in your. It's being served up daily now, and I think the book, through the generations, layer those factors and realities. So it in fact, I'm going to reread it because I think it's a good moment to go back in and think about how we think about the power structures that have come out of white wealth in this country and determine so much of how the rest of us live.
Great. Angie would like to know, why couldn't Reg die? Is it because he needs to fulfill his, quote, magical Negro, unquote, role in the story?
Well, I was mentioning that like very early on. It was like, okay, so what happens? What should happen? And that's the kind of thing that novelists think about, like, okay, so if I did that, what is that going to mean? And where you figure out the kind of direction in order, as you're thinking about like what you want a character, what do you want to happen with the character. So it was the question of like what's picked up by having that narrative. So it's not so much like why couldn't he, but what it means if he does and what that suggests about the narrative and all that. And I mean, it's also true that he was, well, I don't want to give too much away, but.
All right, I think that is
Also, it's a cliche that the Black character. I mean, Black people have lives, regular, boring lives, and every time they show up in white people's imagination, they have dramatic lives where they pass away, or get hung up, or die of drug overdoses, or some shit, and sometimes people just live their lives.
Right. Yeah, sometimes they leave the island and go on and have their whole rest of their lives. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we have one from Himari, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. What can fiction accomplish that nonfiction can't in terms of talking about race? I would love to hear thoughts from both Claudia and Sarah.
Claudia, do you want to start?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I guess that the part of what fiction allows is a way to feel you sort of feel your way forward, that, that plot and character dramatize questions about race in this case, or class, and that the dramatization, the sort of how, is immersive in a way that I think presumably allows you to maybe see or feel differently. The argument is always there, but it is being dramatized. It's being, you're in the world of the fiction in order to see.
I don't write fiction, so. Sarah, that's yours.
Yeah.
But I think all writing achieves things differently and the same. And I think, I don't know how fiction writers write fiction. I really don't. I couldn't hold all that in my head at the same time.
Okay, Susan would like to know, sorry, did you want to say something?
Maybe this should be the last question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there another book that either of you would recommend as a companion to the guest book, perhaps by a Black writer?
Well, I guess, one of the things that, when did it come out? Earlier this year. Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer is about the Black family, specifically in the institution of slavery. And he talks a lot about that as being the place he wanted to center the way in which the family and the family unit was, and what's passed down and what's not passed down within the structure that is, dedicated to ripping it apart. So I feel like that's in some ways, and again, to Claudia's point about property and identity and where that is in the American narrative, I think that is what sort of comes to mind just right now.
Mm-hmm. There's An American Marriage, Tari.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That would be great, too. Completely.
Yeah. Margo Jefferson, it's memoir, but it also, it's an interesting breakdown of class within wealthy Black families. That might be of interest.
Great. All right. Well, we certainly thank both of you so much for this great discussion and for giving us this time. And we thank everybody else for coming. And hope you have a great night and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take
Bye.
care.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.